I got this DeWalt 735 planer from Teg Tools in Hamilton, and it gave it to me to get some exposure on my YouTube channel and website. The cool thing is, Teg Tools is mostly in it for the exposure. They don't actually care that much what I think of the planer. These planers tend to retail for about $750 Canadian, and I'll be comparing it to this planer, which I bought 5 years ago on sale for $200 Canadian. What's unique about the DeWalt is it has a built-in blower which is on the back side of the motor, and that sucks the chips out here and blows them out here. Whereas this cheap planer has got the shroud here, and you need to hook up some kind of shop vac or dust extractor to here. The problem with that is if you run it without dust collection, it throws the chips everywhere and causes huge amounts of dust in the air. By comparison, this dust chute, if you don't have a shop vac connected on it, will always plug up. But this can be removed. And this one didn't come with a chute that ejects straight out, so I'm just going to attach a piece of plywood in here instead. The shavings from this one fell very near the planer, and these are from softwood and these are from hardwood, and you can see there's some really long shavings in here, and these can really plug up a cyclone. So an advantage of this blower in here is it tends to shred the shavings a bit. So looking at the shavings that came out of the DeWalt, they're all a little short a little bit, so these are not likely to plug up a cyclone. But if you're planning on using a planer without dust collection, this one wins because it makes so much less of a mess. But the blower inside this one blows really hard. Let's measure how hard. So that's almost twice the static pressure of my big dust collector and slightly more static pressure than my small dust collector. So I figured I should be able to just run this without even turning the small dust collector on, because this thing pushes the air out so hard. I don't need the fan in this one, right? Except there's a problem with that, because this one relies on vacuum to keep this seal closed, and this seal closed, so I still have to turn this one on. My next test will be noise levels when run with a dust collector, so I jammed my dust collector behind these boards so that it won't make as much noise, so I get mostly the noise from the planers. Well, both of these planers are very loud, though the DeWalt is louder, and without a hose on it, it's ridiculously loud. And with that really powerful blower in there, you don't necessarily need a dedicated dust collector. All you have to do is just blow that air into a big filter bag, and that's all you need. Now I do have a concern, and that is that this chip blowing impeller in here is actually made out of plastic, which means if you use this planer a lot, that impeller may wear out prematurely. Now on the DeWalt, the height adjustment is with 4 really big screws in the corners, and there's some nuts that twist on there, which are turned by this handle, and they're coupled together with a chain, and that makes for a super solid height adjustment, which should cut down on snipe, because snipe is mostly caused by the planer's head moving up and down as the wood passes over the rollers. I made a whole video on that topic. Whereas on this cheap planer, height adjustment is with 2 screws on either side, and there's a crank on top of one of the screws, and they're coupled together with some really chintzy little bevel gears that are below the table. To do a snipe comparison, I'm going to take a big chunk of hardwood and plane a little bit off of both sides with either planer. So a snipe causes a bit of a step near the end of a piece of wood, And on the DeWalt, it's right here, and this one is about 2.5 thou right here. And on the other end, it's about 2 thou. That's 2/1000ths of an inch. And let's measure the other side. And again, about 2 thou. And now with the cheap Mastercraft planer, right here we have, that's about 2.5 thou. And on the other end, 3.5 thou. And other side, about 3 thou, 5 thou right there. Now I ended up running both of these tests twice because the first time I ran them I had a bit of shavings underneath the piece of wood, and that adds a bit of springiness, and that made the snipe worse. And I had the same problem with both planers. I'm a bit disappointed that the internal vacuum, even though it's very powerful, isn't more effective at sucking up all the chips. And snipe with the DeWalt is only about 2/3 as much as it is with the Mastercraft, which is a disappointingly small difference. But interestingly, the snipe is much further from the end on here versus the Mastercraft, especially on this side of things. So the reason the snipe is further from the end on the DeWalt is that the rollers, the feed rollers, are actually further from the cutter head than on the other planer. And as the wood comes in, as it gets to this point here, it hits the outfeed roller. That applies more upward pressure to the head, and it flexes a little bit, and so the step is right about here, the same distance from the end of the piece of wood as this roller is from the cutter head. And then as the wood comes out, once the infeed roller drops off of it, again that releases a bit of pressure and the head comes back down a bit, and that causes a step right here. And on the cheap planer, the rollers are just a little bit closer to the head, which makes that snipe step closer to the end of the piece of wood. Now, other than cutting off the piece with a snipe, another approach is to just feed another piece of wood before and after it, and that way the rollers won't roll off of the end, but it just rolls onto the other piece, and that way the snipe is on the piece of scrap wood. Now on the Mastercraft I can get away with planing a piece this short, but on the DeWalt I would need a much longer piece for it to even make it out the planer. So the irony is the fancy height adjustment mechanism on the DeWalt only makes the snipe slightly less, but with the snipe so much further from the ends on the DeWalt, I think the snipe on the cheap thickness planer is actually less of a problem. And I think part of the reason this one isn't doing any better is because the height adjustment columns are so far from the cutter head, which is where it really matters, whereas here you have the height adjustment columns and they're right where the cutter head is, and so that means there's less opportunity for things to flex between the height adjustment mechanism and the cutter head. Now examining the wood some more, you can see a slight waviness. If I hold it against the light just right, you can see some vertical lines on here from the cheap Mastercraft planer, and this was planed on the DeWalt, and you can see the snipe here and here, but we see much less of these vertical lines on here, so I guess the more solid height adjust mechanism does have an advantage, although not so much for the snipe. Now some of you will say, well, if you put extending tables on this one, the snipe will be less worse, but for short pieces of wood on these planers, it's not the extending tables that matters. I have a video on that topic, please go and watch it before commenting. When I first ran a piece of wood through this one, it just came out silky smooth. Way smoother than this one, but then I realized, hey, I hadn't actually sharpened the knives on this one since I bought it 5 years ago, so I gave them a quick hand sharpening, and now this one is almost as smooth as this one. So really, it's more the knives than the planer that cause it to be smooth. Now that silky smoothness was on the high speed. If I set on a low speed, it's also silky smooth. I figured maybe for some difficult grain like this figured maple. Unfortunately, I don't have any bird's eye maple at this point. And so this part here was planed at the low speed, and this was planed at the high speed, and you can see there's some tear out right there, which you don't get so much here. So if you've got some figured wood, the low speed could actually be useful. And by comparison, this is with the cheap Mastercraft planer, and we've got tear out all along. A little bit worse than this one, but that's because this one has 3 knives, so it has more cuts per inch than this one. And you'll notice, holding it just right with the light, both of these are a little bit nicked. So I've already nicked the knives on the DeWalt, even though I've just started to use it. And I've read on the net, a lot of people complain about the knives on the DeWalt being not very hard. I think this is probably true. Whereas on my Mastercraft planer, the cheap one, I'd been using the same knives for 5 years, and it was still doing okay. An advantage of this one only having 2 knives is it's less costly to get them sharpened, or less work to sharpen them yourself. But being an old style cutter head, these are actually kind of tricky to get in and out. I have a video on that. Whereas on this one, it's 3 knives. The knives have 2 cutting edges, so you can flip them around once. But after that, you kind of have to throw them out, so it costs you money every time, but easier to replace. Weight-wise, this one is lighter, which is an advantage. I just weighed this one at 32 kilograms, and this one says it weighs 42 kilograms. So even though it looks a lot heavier, it's only about 1/3 times heavier than this one. Another feature on the DeWalt is it has this wheel for setting stops for how far down you can adjust it to certain standard thicknesses. I don't see this as a terribly useful feature. The DeWalt also has this gauge which shows how much material you're removing, and it can remove up to 1/8 of an inch of material. Whereas on the cheap Mastercraft planer, I can only remove a maximum of 3/32 of an inch, and it has this tab in the middle, so that in the middle you can only remove 1/16 of an inch, just to make sure you don't try to cut off 3/32 of an inch across the whole width. On this one, there's no such restriction, although this thing here shows the maximum width that you should cut for any given depth. So is this a better planer? I think it's a little bit better. But at 3 times the price, is it really 3 times as good? Definitely not. But before I recommend you buy a cheap planer, for instance like this one, well, there's quality issues with this model of planer as well. On this one, I noticed early on the boards were just a tiny bit thicker on one side than on the other side. So I took it apart on the bottom and loosened the bevel gears and just adjusted one of the threaded rods without the other one to get that head parallel. John Heist has had a similar issue with his. And another problem that John Heist has had with his planer is the gear reduction, which is on here to drive the feed off the motor. On his, the gear started to slip and basically the planer was junk. On mine, I haven't had any problems like that yet. So if you're comfortable with planers and don't mind sharpening your own knives and tinkering a bit, a cheap planer is the way to go. But if you're intimidated by planers and knife changes and all that, you may have to spend more money and buy something like this. And thanks again to Teg Tools in Hamilton for providing me with this planer for free and being very easygoing about how I review it.